All right, how's it going, my magnificent sons of bitches? Here to do a really quick video. There probably won't be too many people watching this right now, and I damn sure don't plan on staying up that long. So, with that being said, I decided to go ahead and do my video on the TCU Georgia Bulldogs, the TCU Horned Frogs, versus the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, um, first off, a lot of the people that watch college football, that follow, are allowed to have an opinion here or anywhere else on college football, really didn't want TCU in. And I meant, it's no surprise because they've never wanted TCU in to anything like this. So there's a lot of animosity towards myself in the SEC as it stands. I've made tons of videos basically saying how, they prefabricate these games to a degree. And so, now you have TCU in. And it's funny because, you go back to what is it, week 2 that Texas Longhorns played Alabama. You know, TCU gets in and they get a win over Michigan, right? All of a sudden it's due to like bad officiating. First off, let's go ahead and make one thing perfectly clear. The touchdown that was supposedly not called, that play should have never ever happened because ultimately that touchdown was scored off a turnover that never should have happened because it was obviously blatantly pass interference on the turnover. And I've got pictures, so I have receipts to go ahead and prove this. But that was blatant pass interference by that linebacker on the receiver for TCU that ultimately caused that interception that ultimately led to the touchdown that was ultimately called back. But ultimately, it's these college fans and various other fans that will sit there and say, "Well, now we want we want to go ahead and hold these officials accountable for these games." Supposedly, you know what I'm saying? They didn't care whenever Texas had 15 penalties for 100 yards versus Alabama's 5 penalties for 30 yards. If Alabama was that great, if Alabama was that good of a team, and if this sport was truly legitimate, Alabama should have beat the hell out of Texas. Should have been a hell of a lot closer than it was, but it wasn't. You understand what I'm saying? So now, you get TCU in here, and then you get the Michigan fans saying, "Oh, well, they took a touchdown off the board." You never should have had that touchdown in the first place. If TCU, if it's called pass interference, TCU gets a touch or gets a first down and quite possibly a touchdown. So that 7 points that the Michigan fans keep claiming that that those points were taken off the board, those points should have never went to you anyways. And then ultimately the officials, and I think that that's exactly what happened. I think the officials understood, hey, wait a minute, and this is why you have to question the integrity of the sport. The official said, "Oh shit, that was pass interference." It's blatantly, the ball wasn't even halfway there. If you go back and watch, I think it is Pat McAfee's video, and then you stop it right where the interceptions happen. They have the replay. You could tell that the linebacker was all over that wide receiver, and it was blatant pass interference. And I think that they figured it out. Hey, this is pass interference, and then ultimately they had the turnover in the end zone where TCU ended up getting it, and they ended up making the score 21-3 anyways. But ultimately, it could have been 28-3, really easy at halftime. So, and then, they claim that, there was some targeting, is what they called. That wasn't targeting. Anybody's going to sit there reasonably that's, watch traditional football would understand that's not targeting. It wasn't targeting for Georgia neither. With the Marvin Harrison hit, it wasn't targeting. But this is kind of like how they've, I guess, regressed in football now. It's hard to play through the ball, and it makes the sport look not as good. This is the problem with the NBA as well. So, TCU gets in. And of course, now we want to have a little bit of integrity in the game all of a sudden, because for the most part, TCU is not supposed to be here. TCU was 5-7 last year. They were expected to finish seventh in their own conference. And they weren't supposed to be anywhere near the playoffs. That being said, you have the perennial SEC giant, which is Georgia, coming in. And make no fucking mistake, the media is trying to build this up, and I've heard a lot of media people out there trying to build this up, like TCU is going to beat Georgia. TCU is going to beat Georgia. Now, with this being said, can TCU beat Georgia? Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And the reason why, I'll tell you why TCU can beat Georgia. They're not going to beat Georgia, but I'll tell you exactly why TCU could beat Georgia. First off, all of these, TCU's a pretty good second half team. They're a 4-quarter team. It's harder to beat them in the second half. You may get up on them in the first half, but they play better in the second half, and they're great closers. I think that ultimately, between their balanced attack of running and passing, and if you didn't happen to watch the Ohio State game, it's their offenses are pretty similar in the passing. I think that TCU has a better running attack. They're more of a balanced offense, but similar. TCU has a similar passing attack, and Max Duggan can scramble in the pocket. We could see that C.J. Stroud could too. C.J. Stroud put up a hell of a game. Now, I want to go ahead and take my hats off to Michigan first off. That was a hell of a performance. They're going to be back. Michigan's going to be back next year. That J.J. McCarthy is a solid quarterback. He's about as solid quarterback as I've seen in, college football in a while. And so Michigan is not in any kind of real trouble. He's a younger quarterback, and younger quarterbacks tend to make mistakes. And I think that, the past 2 years, he's going to learn from them. And I do think that, they'll be right back in this thing next year. I believe that. Michigan did play a hell of a game. They may lack a little bit. Their running game may have taken a bit of a hit. But ultimately, I think that Michigan's going to be pretty solid for making a return because J.J. McCarthy will be coming back. And ultimately, I think that he'll be able to go ahead and, it may make it 3 in a row since they got to play Ohio State at their house now, to get back in. Like I said, they're a solid team. Michigan is one of those teams that I've said time and time again needs to make a comeback. It's one of those teams. There's a lot of teams that need to make a comeback, and Michigan is one of them. So all these teams were fairly solid. I could tell you right now that Ohio State with C.J. Stroud and Marvin Harrison Jr. and, that offense, that they were a solid team. So no doubt that both Michigan and Ohio State deserved to be in their spots. Then you got Georgia. And I'm not going to sit there and say that Georgia is a horrible team and doesn't deserve to be in that spot. However, whenever you look at the mainstream media, they graduated a lot of people on that defense last year. And to be honest with you, Georgia really wasn't tested all that much. They were gifted LSU. They didn't even have to play Alabama. Not like Alabama was that great. And by no means Alabama wasn't as good as everybody's trying to pretend that they are. And this is where we're at in college football. The SEC gets favoritism. They'll get the media pushing them. You have the media trying to push Alabama into that playoff spot. And like I said, Alabama's lucky that they played at Kansas State with their backup quarterback. Because if Alabama would have gotten into the playoffs, they would have gotten embarrassed by Georgia in the playoffs yet again. That would have happened. I don't think that Bryce Young is as good as advertised. I certainly don't believe that he's as good as the media's pretending he is. Oh, well, he's just a better passer. He just got a better passing. Whenever you're throwing to wide receivers, this was the issue I had with Trevor Lawrence. This is the issue I had with Justin Fields. This is an issue that I've had with the litany of people coming in the NFL that to play quarterback. It doesn't matter if you can hit a wide receiver that's open by 10 yards. To me, that's not impressive. A lot of the Tua Tagovailoa, same thing. He's throwing to wide open wide receivers. Can you make the NFL throws in tight windows and throw your receivers open whenever that times? Can you make plays with your legs? Can you keep plays alive? And you don't really get to see that sense of sense of urgency from a Bryce Young, from a Tua Tagovailoa, from a Trevor Lawrence. You know what I'm saying? From a Justin Fields, because their wide receivers were open by 10 yards. CJ Stroud definitely can make those NFL throws. I've seen him, watched him play, watched a lot of his games, and he can make those throws. So, to me, he's probably the most NFL-ready quarterback coming out of this draft class. Now you get down to Stetson Bennett. Stetson Bennett is a good quarterback. I won't say he's on the level of a CJ Stroud because he's not. He's, I don't even know if really he's on the level of a Max Duggan, to be honest with you. Because Max Duggan can make plays with his legs. I'm not sure if that's Stetson Bennett's game. There's nothing wrong if it isn't. However, with that being said, he just doesn't have to make that. This is why I like Sam Ehlinger so much, is because Sam Ehlinger carried the Longhorns, and a lot of those plays he had to make himself. It's another good thing that, that's one thing that I like about Max Duggan, is that a lot of the plays that he has to make himself. And so, and it just benefits his team right now. His team benefits off of that. So TCU does have a pretty solid core. TCU could win. But I allude back to the Alabama-Texas game, where the penalties are what killed the Longhorns. Yeah, 15 penalties for 100 yards. You're probably not going to win the ball game, especially whenever your opponent has less than 10, whenever they have 5 penalties for 30 yards. Basically, the referees gifted Alabama, 70 yards. So now we look at we look at this how it's shaping up right now, and we can see that you have TCU, and they're going to get everybody. They're going to get everybody behind them. Whenever you look at a majority of the country, already a majority of the country supports TCU, so they're just trying to stack up those betting lines. TCU was a 200 to 1 underdog to go ahead and make it this far into this, make it into the playoffs. Probably one of the longest shots in college football to make it to into the playoffs right now. Ultimately, nobody thought that they could beat Michigan. Michigan was heavily favored. I think Michigan was favored by was it 7.5? They were favored by 7.5 points. Alabama's favored by 13. And I can tell you right now, TCU is a good team. And like I said, they can beat Georgia. But will they beat Georgia? Probably not. They're probably not going to beat Georgia because it's the SEC. And they'll fucking tell you on ESPN. Clay Travis will tell you the same thing. And so a lot of the independents here on YouTube will tell you the same thing. It's the SEC branding. It's a market. They don't play. It's a market. And ultimately, you would think that they'd want to break the monotony. But hell, how much did they break the monotony whenever Washington got in, or when Oregon got in? It's not like there's a lot of diversity in these playoffs, which there very well should be. because, when you look at college football, you have a class. It only stays there for 4 years. You win a title, maybe even possibly two, but that's hard to do. That class graduates and you start all over, start building back up, start getting your players in there. And then, ultimately, they shouldn't be competing for titles year after year, year in and year out. That's not the way college football is supposed to be. And so it's becoming a parody of a sport, basically. You know, it's just becoming a sad parody of the NFL. And ultimately, it's almost like a minor league game, and there's too much show, not enough athletics in it. This is why it kind of breaks the monotony having guys in there like, you know, Max Duggan here, because Max Duggan is an athlete. Quentin Johnson is probably a once in a lifetime wide receiver out there, probably pretty close to Julio Jones or Calvin Johnson type of wide receiver out there. Marvin Harrison Jr. is too. You know what I'm saying? You've had athletes perform on this, in this playoff series. And I think that ultimately this is what's made it this certain year kind of intriguing a little bit, because you haven't had your Alabamas in there. You don't have your Georgias in there. Well, you have your Georgia in there. But, in your Ohio State, Georgia and Ohio State were the two that's the mainstays. You're never going to get rid of a SEC team, and you're either going to have an Ohio State or a Clemson. They'll always be in there. You're not going to have your USCs in there traditionally. Everybody else. This is kind of like it went from a Power 5 conference to a Power 3 conference. And those conferences are the SEC, the ACC, and the Big Ten. Everybody else has to fight for that last spot. The Big 12 and the Pac 12 and the AAC and all these other conferences have to fight for that last spot. And so TCU just got kind of blessed to get in there. They got blessed to get a good matchup with Michigan because they didn't want Michigan, and they didn't want Michigan and Ohio State playing each other. That was the whole deal. They didn't want them facing each other at all in the playoffs, because it's okay for Alabama to play Georgia in the championship games. That's okay for them, and they've already done it. How many times so far? They've had Georgia and Alabama play these national championship games. So TCU isn't as bad as everybody wants you to think that they are, and Georgia isn't as good as everybody wants you to think that they are. The Big 12 isn't as bad as everybody wants you to think that they are, and the SEC isn't as good as everybody wants you to think that they are. But I'm going to explain the resentment from the Big 12, from this conference, to the SEC. See, what happens is that the SEC gets all these opportunities. Now, probably back, I'd say, 15 years ago, yeah, a lot of people were sleeping on the SEC. The SEC was probably the best conference at the time. You had Tim Tebow doing his thing in Florida. You had an Alabama team that was starting to finally come up. You had LSU out there that was always competitive and dangerous. Auburn was a team that was coming up. So back then, yeah, the SEC was being slept on, probably back in the 2004s, 2005, 2006, 2007, all the way up until 2008. But the college football doesn't stay, it's not going to be the dominant conference forever. You know what I'm saying? Those conferences shift because it is college football. Certain kids go to certain schools. They want to compete in different areas, different markets and whatnot, not just one main market. And that's the Southeast market. Some of the kids want to go to California and compete in the LA market. Some kids want to go up north and compete in that Northeast market in Notre Dame. Some kids want to go to Austin, compete in the Austin market. So you're never going to have one particular powerhouse. That's not the way college football is set up to be. But it has been, I'd say, for the past 10 years at least. So now, what happens? After a while, people get tired of your Alabamas. people are going to eventually get tired of your Georgias too in these championship games. People are tired of your Clemsons always hijacking these fights. People are getting kind of tired of Ohio State. You see what I'm saying? And then you stack the decks up against other conferences with your AP polls, with your coaches' polls. So what happens whenever people get tired of it? Whenever people are losing interest in it? Whenever not as many people are watching your title game with Alabama and Georgia as you would like. Well, now we got to go to other conferences and steal their teams. The SEC has poached Texas A&M, Missouri, Texas, and Oklahoma from the Big 12, like scavengers. This just goes to show you that socialism still depends on capitalism to go ahead and build up a team. So you can go ahead and poach from the capitalists. That's ultimately what socialists do anyways. They go ahead and take from other people who, that have a quality product that still have some sort of interest. So, I mean, ultimately they took our top two teams into their conferences and awarded them a spot in their conference, and they went. This is one of the reasons why, as a Texas fan, I don't know if I can actually go for Texas whenever they go into the SEC. I don't think I'm going to be able to go for them anymore. Just because I don't respect the conference. I don't, it's just not one of those things to where it's like, yeah, you know what? I may start going for TCU. I like TCU, actually. I'm definitely going for TCU right now in this game. And like I said, TCU needs this title more because ultimately the SEC has already pretty much picked, and mind you, it's like championship belts in wrestling. Those titles mean something. They bring prestige to your division, and the SEC has kind of just taken 25 titles out of this conference and whatnot. So, I mean, and the Pac-12 is kind of is dilapidating too, as they're being picked apart by the Big Ten. So, yeah, it's just power-hungry, mad, insane. Disney, pretty much run college football. And so they're killing off the competition right now, which is the Big 12, which is the Pac-12. I mean, ultimately, the Big 12 and the Pac-12, between the Texas market and the California market, could dominate the SEC market. Let's be real. As far as, interest. There's more than enough people between the Central Texas and the Southern California market to go ahead and dwarf anything that the SEC could put up. That's including Georgia and Florida, which Georgia and Florida are your biggest markets in the SEC. Now they bring in the actual Texas market, not the perceived Texas market. See, they thought that they could get some of the Texas market to watch the SEC, or if they bought in Texas A&M. But Texas A&M was a marginalized market. Texas is the market for Texas. So that's why they're having to bring in Texas. But, ultimately, like I said, it's just, it's so annoying watching watching your Alabamas and watching your Georgias go ahead and take advantage of everybody else. Not having to worry about scheduling, any really, really quality competition outside of their conference. They don't have to, because whenever you have and this just shows you exactly these people who make these rankings. They had in the top 10, they had Texas A&M, Oklahoma, and Baylor. And none of those teams are ranked in the top 20. And you go back and look down at all the rankings, the preseason rankings, how many teams are not in there anymore? That were ranked in the top 20. Dare I say, quite a few. So they're not even doing their due process. Nobody in their right mind would have ever said that Oklahoma was a top 10 team. They lost their starting quarterback. They lost a lot of players, not only just through the draft, but also through the transfer portal. They lost their coach, and they were ranked number 9. It just shows you how lazy the AP and the coaches poll really are. I don't know why they would rank Oklahoma at number 9, but they were ranked number 9. Baylor was ranked number 10, and maybe I can understand that because they were in a big bowl last year. You know, they've had a pretty steady product. I don't know if I would have ranked them number 10 myself. They did lose, a lot of players in the draft as well, but it is what it is. A&M, you know, they lost 7 games. So they're not, they're certainly not ranked. So it just shows you that they're not even doing their own due diligence. So now the ending to this football season will be TCU, the fairy tale underdogs, and this is what they're going to try to get people invested in. They're going to try to get, it's the Disney ending. This if it would have been if TCU was Tim Tebow, if it was Florida, if this was Tim Tebow and this was Florida and Georgia, TCU would be getting a lot more respect probably. But ultimately, and they would probably get the win. TCU would win if they were the Florida Gators. They would win if they were the Florida Gators. However, they're not the Florida Gators. They're not in the SEC. And ultimately, this is the determining factor. This is exactly what, and there's no continuity in football. You're either going to be in the SEC, you're going to be in the ACC, or you're going to be in the Big Ten. That's it. Now, like I said, who needs this game more? Certainly TCU needs it more than Georgia. Because right now, we have some teams coming in. They're trying to keep the conference afloat. Ultimately, I would be happy if Nebraska, Colorado, Texas A&M, Missouri, if they wanted to come back to the Big 12 conference, I'd be happy with that. Maybe bring in a Notre Dame or something, another big team like that, and compete with the SEC. I'd be okay with that. Maybe link up with the Pac-12 and see what we can do there. I would be okay with that. But certainly, college football is going to get less and less interesting unless, they can break up these little monopolies here that are trying to push their way in. It has nothing to do with capitalism. It has totally to do with fascism. These social little freaking college conferences that you have where you just award title after title after title after title to, because they can't support themselves. It's just going to kill off interest. It's going to kill off interest into the market. So ultimately what you're going to do, there's going to be less and less interest in college football if it's constantly Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Georgia, Alabama, year after year. Just go back and look at the titles, for fuck's sake, of college football and who's allowed to participate in it, pretty much. Go back and look at the preseason polls for every year, and it's always stacked with SEC teams. So they don't set the bar too high for the SEC, but they definitely set it higher for everybody else. So, anyways, yeah, I would, if I was to guess, and I was to make my prediction today, I'll say that Georgia, because Vegas is not going to set the fucking point spread at 13 and what is it? Was it 11.5, 13? Forgot what. Yeah, almost to 2 touchdowns. It's almost 2 touchdowns that they're favored by, and they've been calling this for a month now. They're not going to set the bar that they're not going to set the point spread that high, and then think that you think that TCU is going to win. So what I predict is this is what I predict is that the final score will probably be something like 42-28 for Georgia. Now maybe, to go ahead and keep everybody invested, they keep the game close, and TCU's moving it down the field or something, and it's 28-35, and then at the end of the game, Max Duggan throws a pick 6 or something, much like what happened against Michigan where they threw 2 pick 6s and whatnot, and Georgia turns around, takes it all the way back, and then they end up making it 42 to go ahead and cover that spread. So I certainly wouldn't be putting any money on TCU because I think, and they may lower that spread. They may lower it down to 10 points where they don't even have to cover that. So maybe it is a 10 point. Maybe it's 28-38 or something for Georgia. But I certainly wouldn't be putting any money on Georgia on TCU, to be honest with you. And I hope TCU wins. I do. I hope they win. But I just don't. They have the ability to. They have the team to. Like I said, TCU is better than a lot of people are predicting, and Georgia's not as good as everybody's telling you they are. Just like Alabama wasn't as good as everybody's telling you are. And if Alabama was as good as everybody was telling you are, then they wouldn't have lost to LSU and Tennessee. They wouldn't have almost lost to Texas. They wouldn't have almost lost to an unranked Texas A&M, even though, you know, the unranked Texas A&M still makes a little bit more sense because at least Texas A&M, LSU, they're in the same, they're in the same conference, so they're going to understand Alabama a little bit better. But they certainly shouldn't have been that close to Texas at all. So, anyways, yeah. Yeah, they're setting people up, and they'll probably be dropping videos on how TCU, and they're going to get as many people as they can to go ahead and put money down on TCU because that's how they end up squeezing you. Everybody likes an underdog story. Everybody likes an underdog story. So, like I said, when you look at California, Texas, well, of course, Texas is going for it. Arizona, pretty much most of the country is going for TCU. So, yeah, Vegas is setting it up. They're setting it up for a cash grab, and ultimately, this is probably what we're going to sit there and we're going to see a lot of this. We're going to see a lot of this build up. And like I said, I like TCU. Quentin Johnson, Kendra Miller, that DeMarcado really surprised me. Max Duggan, and that's another reason why TCU can beat them is because a lot of these guys are seniors, juniors and seniors. This is going to be their last chance. TCU will graduate a lot of players this season. So a lot of these guys are older. They're more mature. A lot of the guys on Georgia are younger. Stetson Bennett's a sophomore. A lot of those guys on that team are sophomores. A lot of their seniors graduated last year. So they're not as experienced as the TCU Horned Frogs. So, it's going to be who's more disciplined, to be honest with you. And like I said, TCU can totally beat Georgia, but will they? Well, you go ahead and look at the Texas game where, Texas lost by 1 point to Alabama, but Alabama only had 5 penalties to Texas's 15. And Alabama should have just totally dominated Texas. That game should have been like, I think, what was it, 20-19 or something? That should have been more like, 40-17 with that many penalties against Texas. But it wasn't. So that just goes to show you, and if you don't believe me, just go look up the penalties in the Alabama-Texas game. It's 15 penalties for 100 yards for Texas, 5 penalties for 30 yards against Alabama. But you can go back and look at a lot of the stuff. Just put Alabama-Texas Longhorns face mask, and you'll see a lot of pictures of Alabama players grabbing face mask. Actually, there's a Miami Hurricane fan that showed me all of those pictures and all the pictures of the penalties that Alabama got away with. So yeah, it's an SEC. It's pretty much, this is the problem with college football. I don't watch a lot of it anymore, and that's why, is because it is set up like that. Where what is there? What's in it for anybody who's a Big 12 fan, or likes a Big 12 team? They're not going to be able to compete in that, that playoff. What good is it for an SEC or a Pac-12 fan? I was hoping, and USC is another one of those teams that needs to get back in. Unfortunately, like your Texas and your USCs that have big fan bases were just brought in by the Big Ten and the SEC, which tend to dominate all of this. And, pretty much the college football playoffs has done more to kill college football than it has to help and do what it was supposed to do. So, anyways, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. I just wanted something out there before the TCU Georgia game I wanted to put it out there. By all means, share it with Michigan fans. Technically, Michigan should have lost 58 to 38. That should have been the score. But, if you wanted your officiating, you wanted honest officiating, you wanted generally good officiating, yeah, Michigan should have lost by 20, according to what I seen from the game. It shouldn't have been as close as it was. The only reason it was because of the officiating and for missed calls and bad calls. So it wouldn't have even been that close if the game was properly officiated. TCU jumped out in front of Michigan. They did what they have to do, and they knew that they could go ahead and control the game a little bit better in the second half. That's exactly what happened. What ended up happening is that, just looking at the game, whether it's prefabricated, whether it's scripted or not, Michigan didn't have any respect for TCU at all, doing that ridiculous play, that ridiculous sweep that they did. I forgot what it's called because I'm too tired right now. They didn't have really that much respect at the beginning of the game. When TCU got up by 14 points, it was going to be hard for them to make that up. And then you throw 2 pick sixes, and it's almost near impossible at that point. And like I said, TCU's defense is what surprised me more than its offense, because I knew what TCU's offense was about. Their defense really surprised me because I was like, well, yeah, they have a good offense, but is their defense going to be able to hang? And their defense hung a little bit better than I thought they would. But anyways, we'll see what happens next week. I do think that you're going to see a lot of penalties on TCU. I think you're going to see a lot of maybe even blown calls or something. You're going to start to see this little drama unfold. And like I said, it's going to be after the betting lines go up on TCU. Whenever people start putting more money down, then they start thinking they're getting a good deal. That's whenever they're gonna pull the rug out from underneath this team, which is unfortunate because, like I said, this title means more to the Big 12 Conference and TCU than it does to Georgia. This is just another thing for them to hang over Alabama, but with them going ahead and poaching so many of our teams, poaching so many of the championships that we've had in this conference, TCU, Baylor, Oklahoma State, they need more titles in this conference to go ahead and, keep up with the other conferences, to go ahead and justify the number ones, number two, number three rankings that we'll have in the ongoing years. So, anyways, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. You people tell me what you think. You like, sub, do the shit YouTube, Facebook, whatever you're watching this on. Tell me to do to get over. And for now, I'm out.